The dog arrived on a Tuesday, 3 days after my husband's funeral, and I didn't want it. It stood in the doorway with Officer Martinez, a German Shepherd mix with one ear that flopped forward and eyes that seemed to apologize for existing. The officer held a leash in one hand and a folder of paperwork in the other, explaining something about Daniel's will, about provisions he'd made about how the dog's name was Scout, and he was 2 years old and fully trained. I signed where she pointed, said thank you in a voice that didn't sound like mine anymore, and closed the door with the dog on the inside and the rest of the world exactly where I wanted it, far away. Scout sat in the entryway for 20 minutes, not moving, barely breathing. I sat on the couch in the living room doing the same thing. The casseroles in the refrigerator had started to smell like failure, like pity, like every well-meaning gesture that couldn't bring Daniel back. The house was too quiet. It had been too quiet since the hospital called, since the words didn't make it, had rearranged every molecule of air into something unbreathable. The dog finally stood, walked into the kitchen, and I heard him lapping water from the bowl Officer Martinez had filled. Then nothing. I waited for demands, for barking, for the kind of neediness that would give me an excuse to call animal control and explain that there had been a mistake, that I couldn't possibly, that I wasn't in any condition to care for another living thing when I could barely remember to care for myself. But Scout just found a corner near the back door and lay down, his head on his paws, watching nothing in particular. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. 3 days passed. I moved through the house like a ghost haunting her own life. Scout moved less, ate little, and seemed to understand that we were both waiting for someone who wasn't coming home. On the 4th day, I woke at 5 in the morning to the sound of him whimpering by the back door. Not loud, not insistent, just a small sound of biological necessity that pulled me from the bed where I'd been lying awake since 3. I opened the door, and he went out into the backyard, into the September darkness that still held the weight of summer. I stood in the doorway in Daniel's old Georgetown sweatshirt, watching the dog disappear into the shadows near the fence line. The neighborhood was silent, except for the distant hum of the highway and the closer sound of sprinklers clicking on, their timers indifferent to tragedy. Scout came back, paused at the threshold, and looked up at me as if asking permission to re-enter. Something about that look, that deference, that uncertainty cracked something small inside my chest. "Come on," I said, and he did. I poured kibble into his bowl because it seemed like the thing to do, watched him eat without enthusiasm, and realized I couldn't remember when I'd last eaten myself. The casseroles, right. I pulled one out at random, something with chicken and rice and a golden crust of breadcrumbs, and ate it cold, standing at the counter while Scout finished his breakfast and returned to his corner. "He wrote a letter," I said to the dog, to the kitchen, to no one. "Did Martinez tell you that?" "A whole letter explaining why I'd need you." My voice sounded strange in the empty house, too loud and too small at the same time. "I haven't read it yet." "It's in the folder with your vet records and your training certificates and proof that my dead husband thought about everything except the part where I'd have to live through this alone." Scout's ears twitched, but he didn't move. I'd met Daniel at a coffee shop on M Street 7 years ago. He was reading a biography of Teddy Roosevelt, and I was pretending to grade papers while actually scrolling through my phone. He'd asked if the seat across from me was taken, even though the place was nearly empty, and I'd said no, even though I'd been hoping to stay invisible. Within 20 minutes, we were talking. Within 2 months, we were inseparable. Within a year, we were married in a small ceremony at the courthouse with his partner from the force and my sister as witnesses. Daniel was a cop, but not the kind you see in movies. He didn't kick down doors, or chase suspects through alleyways. He worked community outreach, spent his days talking to kids at schools and organizing neighborhood watch programs, and trying to build bridges in places where bridges had burned down long ago. He believed in people, which I'd always found both admirable and slightly naive. He thought the world could be better if everyone just tried a little harder to understand each other. I taught high school English and thought most people were idiots, but loved them anyway. We balanced each other out. The heart attack came without warning. 42 years old and healthy, except for the stress he pretended didn't exist. He'd been at the station, finishing paperwork, when his body simply decided it was done. They rushed him to Georgetown University Hospital. I made it there in 17 minutes, but he was already gone. Just gone. Like a light switching off, like a story ending mid-sentence. The funeral was on a Saturday. People I'd never met stood in line to tell me how much Daniel had meant to them, how he'd changed their lives, how he'd been one of the good ones. I shook hands and accepted hugs, and nodded at the right times while feeling nothing except the desperate need for everyone to leave me alone. Now it was Tuesday again. 1 week later. The dog and I had achieved a kind of cold coexistence, two creatures stuck in the same space, neither knowing what came next. At 6 a.m, Scout appeared beside the bed, not whining, not pawing, just standing there in the gray pre-dawn light like a silent reminder that the world was still turning. I got up, let him out, and this time I followed him into the backyard. The air was cool, finally. September in Washington always felt like the city exhaling after holding its breath all summer. I sat on the back steps while Scout investigated the perimeter of the yard, nose to the ground, tail at half-mast. When he finished, he came and sat beside me, not touching, but close enough that I could feel his warmth. "He picked you out 6 months ago," I said, because apparently I was the kind of person who talked to dogs now. The letter said he'd been thinking about it for a while. Something about wanting to make sure I had company. Like he knew. I pulled the sweatshirt tighter around myself. He couldn't have known, right? People don't just know they're going to die. Scout leaned slightly against my leg, the smallest gesture of contact. I started crying then, really crying for the first time since the hospital. Not the polite tears at the funeral or the silent leaking in the shower, but the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep and animal, the kind that scares you with its intensity. Scout didn't move away. He just sat there, solid and warm and alive, while I fell apart in the gray morning light. When I finally stopped, when I'd wrung myself dry, the sun was coming up through the oak trees at the back of the yard. The world looked exactly the same as it had before Daniel died, which seemed impossibly cruel. How could the sun still rise? How could the sprinklers still click on at 5:30 and the neighbors still leave for work at 7 and the mail still arrive every afternoon at 2? How could everything continue when the most important thing had stopped? "I'm supposed to go back to work on Monday," I told Scout. "First day of school, new semester. They said I could take more time, but what's the point? It's not like staying home is going to bring him back." The dog looked at me with those dark, knowing eyes. "You probably need a walk or something," I said. "That's what dogs need, right? Walks in structure and someone who has their shit together." I laughed, a harsh sound. Tough luck on that last part. But I got up and I went inside and I found the leash in the folder Officer Martinez had left. Scout stood patiently while I attached it to his collar, and then we were walking, down the front steps and onto the sidewalk and into the waking neighborhood. Our street was lined with old row houses, the kind with brick facades and iron railings and small front gardens that people tended with varying degrees of care. Daniel and I had bought ours 3 years ago, had spent weekends painting walls and refinishing floors and arguing good-naturedly about whether to keep the vintage light fixtures or replace them with something more modern. We'd landed on keeping them. Daniel always leaned toward preservation. I'd barely noticed the neighborhood since he died. Now, walking with Scout in the early morning light, I saw it as if for the first time. Mrs. Chun was watering her roses 3 houses down. The Johnsons had put up new shutters, painted a deep blue that looked almost purple in the shadows. Someone had left a bag of donations on the curb in front of the corner store, already picked through by early morning scavengers. Scout walked at a measured pace, not pulling, not lagging. His training was evident in every movement. When we reached the corner, he sat automatically, waiting for my cue to cross. I wondered what else Daniel had taught him, what other small miracles were embedded in this animal I hadn't wanted. We walked 4 blocks, turned around, walked back. By the time we reached the house, I was breathing hard, my body reminding me that I'd barely moved in a week. Scout waited while I fumbled with the door, then followed me inside and returned to his corner by the back door as if this was already routine. I made coffee, burned toast, sat at the kitchen table with Daniel's letter still unopened in its envelope. The handwriting on the front was his, my name in the careful script he used for important things. How long had he sat at his desk at the station, writing this? What had he been thinking? Did he really believe I'd need a dog, or was this some kind of superstition, a way of protecting me against a future he couldn't control? I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out 2 pages, front and back, covered in his writing. Sarah, it started. No, dear Sarah, no preamble, just my name. If you're reading this, something has happened to me. I'm sorry. I'm so fucking sorry. I know you're angry right now. You're probably angry at me for dying, angry at yourself for not preventing it somehow, angry at the universe for being unfair. That's okay. Be angry. You're allowed. But listen, I need you to do something for me. I need you to take care of Scout. I know you're thinking this is the last thing you need, another responsibility when you can barely handle the ones you have. But trust me on this. You need him as much as he needs you. I picked him out at a shelter in Silver Spring 6 months ago. They found him on the side of the road in Virginia. No collar, no chip, no history. Someone just abandoned him. Can you believe that? Left him like he was nothing. But he's not nothing, Sarah. He is smart and loyal, and he doesn't ask for much except consistency and kindness and someone to show up for him every day. Sound familiar? I've been training him on weekends when you thought I was working overtime. Sorry for lying. I justified it by thinking of it as a surprise, a gift for the future, even though I couldn't have told you what future I was preparing for. I just had this feeling, this sense that you might need him someday. Call it cop instinct or paranoia or whatever you want. I'm not sorry I did it. Here's what I need you to know about Scout. He's not just a pet. He's trained for emotional support work. He can sense when you're having a bad day. He'll come sit with you. Not pushy, just present. Let him. Don't push him away because you think you need to handle everything alone. You don't. Take him for walks, even when you don't feel like it. Especially when you don't feel like it. Get out of the house. See the neighborhood. Talk to people. I know you think you're an introvert who hates small talk, but you're also someone who comes alive around others, even when you don't realize it. Scout will give you a reason to leave the house, to interact, to be part of the world. Feed him twice a day. Walk him at least once, preferably twice. He likes routine. So do you, even if you pretend otherwise. Let him sleep in the bedroom if he wants to. He's house-trained, and he doesn't shed much. And Sarah, please don't blame yourself for whatever happened to me. Life is random and unfair, and sometimes people die before they're supposed to. That's not on you. What matters is what you do next. You're stronger than you think. You're braver than you believe, and you're not alone, even when it feels like you are. I love you. I've loved you since that day in the coffee shop when you were pretending to grade papers and I was pretending to read about Teddy Roosevelt. I'll love you long after whatever comes next. Take care of Scout. Let him take care of you. Always, Daniel, I read it 3 times, sitting at the kitchen table while my coffee went cold and the toast turned to cardboard on my plate. Scout remained in his corner, watching me with patient eyes. "You're a surprise," I said to him. "A 6-month secret project. That's very Daniel, honestly. Planning for disasters he couldn't predict." I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope, then got up and walked over to where Scout lay. "Okay, I'll try. I can't promise I'll be good at this, but I'll try." Scout's tail thumped once against the floor. The rest of the week fell into an accidental routine. I woke early because Scout needed to go out. I walked him because he needed exercise. I fed him because he needed to eat. And somewhere in meeting his needs, I started meeting my own. I showered. I ate actual meals. I opened the curtains and let light into the house. On Saturday, I finally dealt with the casseroles, emptying the containers and washing them so I could return them to their owners. Some were labeled with names and addresses. Others I'd have to guess. It felt good to have a task, something concrete and accomplishable. Mrs. Chun was working in her garden when I walked over with her dish, cleaned and dried. She looked up as I approached, her face breaking into a warm smile that immediately made me want to cry. "Sarah, dear, how are you holding up?" "I'm here," I said, which was the most honest answer I could give. She stood, brushing soil from her knees. "That's something. Being here is something." She glanced past me to where Scout sat on the sidewalk, waiting. "Is that your dog?" "It's complicated," I said. "He was Daniel's, sort of." "A surprise." Mrs. Chun nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Daniel was always thinking ahead. He helped my grandson with his college applications last year. Did you know that? Spent hours with him, reading through essays, helping him understand what the schools were looking for. Tommy got into Maryland. Full scholarship. I didn't know that. There were probably hundreds of things Daniel had done that I didn't know about, kindnesses scattered throughout the neighborhood like seeds. "He was good," I said, and my voice broke on the word. "He was," Mrs. Chun agreed, "and so are you. Don't forget that. You're good too, Sarah." I walked home with Scout, with the empty casserole dish, with Mrs. Chun's words echoing in my head. The house felt less empty when we got there, or maybe I'd just gotten used to the emptiness. It was hard to tell the difference. Sunday, I read. I'd been an English teacher for 8 years, and I'd barely touched a book since Daniel died, but on Sunday, I pulled out an old favorite, To Kill a Mockingbird, which I reread every few years, and settled onto the couch with Scout at my feet. The rhythm of the language was soothing, the story familiar enough that I could sink into it without having to concentrate too hard. Scout sighed in his sleep, and I found myself reaching down to rest my hand on his side, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing. It was the first time I'd voluntarily touched him, the first time I'd initiated contact. He shifted slightly, pressing into my hand, and we stayed like that for hours. Monday came too quickly. First day of school. I laid out clothes the night before, packed my bag, set my alarm for 5 instead of 6 to make sure I had time to walk Scout before I left. When the alarm went off, I felt the familiar churn of anxiety in my stomach. I didn't want to go. I wanted to stay in the house with the curtains closed and pretend the world didn't exist. But Scout needed to go out, and I'd promised Daniel I'd try, so I got up. The walk was longer than usual. I needed the time to prepare, to put on the mask of competence I'd be expected to wear all day. Scout seemed to sense my mood and stayed close, not wandering, not investigating every smell, just present. "I have to leave you here all day," I told him as we headed back toward the house. "Is that okay? Are you going to destroy the furniture, or have some kind of breakdown?" Scout's expression suggested he had no such plans. I left him water and food, made sure the back door was locked, but the doggy door Daniel had apparently installed without my knowledge was accessible. I drove to school in a daze, parked in my usual spot, and walked into the building where I'd spent the last 8 years of my professional life. It looked exactly the same, smelled the same. The hallways were loud with student chatter and the squeak of new sneakers on polished floors. My classroom was on the 3rd floor, room 312, with windows overlooking the football field and a poster of Edgar Allan Poe looking moody beside the door. I made it through first period by clinging to the lesson plan I'd written weeks ago, before everything changed. Introduction to American Literature, syllabus review, expectations for the semester. The students were mostly juniors, mostly quiet, mostly willing to let me do my thing without asking difficult questions. Second period was the same. Third period, one student asked if I was okay, if I'd been sick, because I'd missed new teacher orientation. I said yes, I was fine, and moved on quickly to discussing the reading list. By lunch, I was exhausted. I ate a protein bar in my classroom with the door closed, checking my phone for the first time in hours. No messages. No emergencies. Just a reminder I'd set for myself to pick up dog food on the way home. The afternoon crawled by. Fourth period. Fifth period. Sixth. By the time the final bell rang, I felt like I'd run a marathon. I gathered my things, said goodbye to the few colleagues who stopped by to welcome me back, and drove home in heavy traffic, my hands tight on the steering wheel. Scout was waiting by the front door when I opened it, tail wagging, eyes bright. The house was intact. No disasters. Just a dog who was genuinely happy to see me. "Hey," I said, dropping my bag on the floor. "I survived. Did you?" He licked my hand, then headed toward the back door. I let him out and stood in the doorway watching him, feeling some of the tension drain from my shoulders. When he came back in, I fed him, then sat on the floor beside him while he ate, my back against the cabinets, too tired to move to the couch. "Daniel was right," I said, "about you, about needing you." I hate that he was right, but he was. Scout finished eating and came to sit beside me, his warmth solid and real. That night I slept better than I had in weeks. Scout slept on the floor beside the bed, close enough that I could hear him breathing in the darkness. It was comforting in a way I hadn't expected, that reminder that I wasn't alone, that another living being was in the house, sharing the space, sharing the silence. The days began to blur together in a way that felt less like grief and more like routine. I woke up. I walked Scout. I went to work. I came home. I walked Scout again. I made dinner. I graded papers. I went to bed. And somewhere in that routine, I started to feel less like I was drowning and more like I was treading water. Not swimming, not yet, but not sinking either. 3 weeks into the school year, I ran into Officer Martinez at the grocery store. She was in uniform, grabbing a sandwich from the deli section during her lunch break. When she saw me, her face lit up with recognition. "Sarah, how's Scout doing?" "He's good," I said, surprised by how much I meant it. "He's really good. We're figuring it out. Daniel would be glad to hear that." She paused, weighing her words. "He talked about you all the time, you know, at the station. How smart you were. How funny. How you could quote poetry at the weirdest times. He was proud of you." I felt my throat tighten. I didn't get to tell him enough how proud I was of him. "He knew," Martinez said with certainty. "Trust me, he knew." We said goodbye, and I finished my shopping in a haze, Martinez's words looping in my head. He knew. How could she be so sure? What if there were things I'd forgotten to say, feelings I'd failed to express? What if my last words to him had been something mundane, like, "Don't forget to pick up milk," or "I'll see you tonight"? I couldn't remember. The morning he died was already fuzzy in my memory, smoothed over by grief into something shapeless and generic. I remembered kissing him goodbye. I remembered him saying he loved me. But had I said it back? I thought so. I hoped so. Scout was waiting in the living room when I got home, and I sat down on the floor beside him and cried into his fur while he held perfectly still, letting me soak his shoulder with tears and snot, and all the mess of grief that kept catching me off guard. I don't know how to do this, I told him. I don't know how to be a person without him. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't quite true. I was being a person. Not the same person I'd been before, but someone. I was getting up in the morning. I was doing my job. I was taking care of Scout and returning casserole dishes and having conversations at the grocery store. I was functioning, which was more than I'd thought possible 3 weeks ago. October arrived with cooler temperatures and leaves that turned the neighborhood into something from a postcard. My students were settling into the rhythm of the class, and I was beginning to remember why I'd chosen teaching in the first place. There was something about watching them discover ideas, make connections, argue passionately about symbolism in The Great Gatsby or the morality of revenge in Hamlet. It reminded me that the world was still full of possibility, still full of people becoming who they were meant to be. On a Thursday evening, I took Scout to a park I'd never been to before, a few miles from our house. Daniel had written the name in the margin of his letter Rock Creek Park with a note that Scout liked the trails. I found the entrance easily enough, parked, and followed the signs to the nearest trail. The park was busy with after-work walkers and joggers, people enjoying the golden hour light that filtered through the trees. Scout pulled slightly on the leash, eager, and I let him lead me down a path that wound along a creek. The sound of water was soothing, the air cool and clean and smelling of earth and leaves. We walked for over an hour, farther than I'd walked in years. My legs ached, but it was a good ache, the kind that reminded me I had a body, that I was still physically present in the world. When we finally turned back toward the car, a sun was setting and the temperature was dropping, and I felt something close to peace. "Thank you," I said to Scout as I opened the car door, and he jumped into the back seat. "For getting me out here. For making me move." He barked once, a short, happy sound, and I laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed since Daniel died, and it startled me with its normalcy. Laughter. Such a simple thing. Such an impossible thing. That night, I dreamed about Daniel for the first time since the funeral. We were in the coffee shop where we'd met, and he was reading his Teddy Roosevelt biography, and I was pretending to grade papers. When he looked up and smiled at me, I knew in the dream that he was dead, that this was memory or fantasy or some kind of visitation. But it didn't matter. He was there. He was smiling. He was whole. "You're doing good," he said, even though we'd never had this conversation in real life. "Keep going." I woke up at 3 in the morning with tears on my face and Scout's nose pressed against my hand. He'd come up onto the bed at some point, breaking his usual pattern of sleeping on the floor. I pulled him closer, buried my face in his fur, and let myself believe for just a moment that Daniel had somehow sent the dream that he was still watching out for me from wherever people go when they die. The rest of October passed in a blur of lesson plans and crisp mornings and walks with Scout through neighborhoods that were starting to feel like mine again. I returned all the casserole dishes. I went to a department meeting without crying. I had coffee with my sister and talked about things other than grief. I was slowly and painfully returning to life. Halloween was difficult. Daniel had loved Halloween, loved the excuse to be silly and dress up and give out candy to neighborhood kids. We decorated the porch together last year, hung fake cobwebs, and put out a bowl of plastic spiders, and bought way too much candy that we ended up eating ourselves after the trick-or-treaters stopped coming. This year, I did nothing. I turned off the porch light and sat in the living room with Scout, ignoring the doorbell when it rang. I wasn't ready. Maybe next year. Maybe never. It was hard to imagine future Halloweens without Daniel's enthusiasm to carry them. November came cold and gray. The clocks fell back, And suddenly it was dark when I got home from work, dark when I walked Scout in the mornings. The city felt subdued, everyone pulling inward, preparing for winter. I started wearing Daniel's sweatshirt every day, stopped caring that it was getting warm, and stretched out. It smelled like him, or maybe like the memory of him. I couldn't tell anymore. Thanksgiving loomed large and unwelcome. My sister invited me to her place in Baltimore, promised a small gathering, just family, nothing overwhelming. I agreed because refusing seemed worse, seemed like giving up entirely. Scout came with me. My sister had said to bring him, that her kids would love him, that it would be good. She was right. The day was easier than I'd expected. Scout charmed everyone, especially my 9-year-old nephew, who spent hours throwing a tennis ball in the backyard, while Scout retrieved it with tireless enthusiasm. I helped with cooking, fell into old patterns of teasing my sister about her overbrining the turkey, played board games after dinner with my niece and nephew. It wasn't until I was driving home, Scout asleep in the backseat, that I realized I'd gone an entire day without the grief being the loudest thing in the room. It was still there, would always be there, but it had shared space with other things. Laughter, connection, normalcy. We're going to be okay, I said to Scout, to the darkness outside the car windows, to Daniel wherever he was. I think we're actually going to be okay. December brought the first snow and the end of the semester. My students took their finals, most of them doing better than expected. A few of them stopping by after their tests to say thank you, or happy holidays, or see you next semester. One student, a quiet girl who sat in the back and rarely spoke, handed me an envelope as she left. Inside was a card with a simple message. Thank you for coming back. I know this semester was hard for you. It was hard for me too, different reasons, and seeing you show up every day made me think I could show up too. I sat at my desk after everyone had gone and cried over that card, over the reminder that even in grief, even in barely functioning, we affect others. We matter to people we don't even realize are watching. I took a photo of the card and texted it to my sister with the caption, "This is why I teach." She responded immediately, "Proud of you. Love you. See you at Christmas." I agreed. We'd do Christmas at my place this year. Small and simple, but together. The week before Christmas, I finally took down the last of Daniel's things that had been sitting in boxes by the front door since September. Clothes to donate, books to give away, papers to sort through. I'd been avoiding it, unable to face the finality of packing up his life, but it was time. The house needed to stop being a shrine and start being a home again. Scout supervised from his corner, watching as I made piles, made decisions, made peace with letting go. Some things I kept his favorite jacket, a few books, photographs. Most things I let go of, trusting that someone else could use them, that Daniel would have wanted them to be useful rather than sitting in boxes gathering dust. When I finished, the house felt different, lighter, like it could breathe again. Christmas Day was actually good. My sister and her family came over. The kids played with Scout in the backyard, despite the cold, and we ate too much food and watched old movies, and didn't talk about Daniel except in passing, in fond memories, in stories that made us laugh instead of cry. After they left, after I'd cleaned up and put away the leftovers, and checked that Scout had food and water, I sat on the couch in the quiet house and felt something I hadn't felt in 4 months. Contentment. Not happiness, not yet, but contentment. The sense that I was where I was supposed to be, doing what I was supposed to do, surviving what I'd been sure would destroy me. We made it through the worst of it, I told Scout, who was sprawled on the floor beside the couch, his belly full of the table scraps my nephew had snuck him. It's probably not over. Grief doesn't work like that. But we made it through. His tail thumped in agreement. New Year's Eve I spent alone, which felt right. I wasn't ready for parties or celebrations or pretending that the turn of a calendar page meant something profound. Instead, I made tea, pulled out Daniel's letter, and read it again by the light of the Christmas tree I hadn't bothered to take down yet. You're stronger than you think. You're braver than you believe. And you're not alone. I'm not alone, I said out loud, and Scout lifted his head at the sound of my voice. I have you. And apparently that's enough. When midnight came, I was already asleep, Scout on the bed beside me, his warmth a comfort against the winter cold outside. January arrived with new semester prep and a determination to try harder, be better, move forward instead of just treading water. I signed up for a weekend workshop on new teaching methods. I started running again, something I'd done before I met Daniel and had let slide over the years. Scout ran with me, matching my pace, pushing me to go a little farther each time. I joined a book club that met at the coffee shop where Daniel and I had first talked. The symmetry felt important, like I was reclaiming that space, making new memories in a place that held so many old ones. The other members were kind, careful not to ask too many personal questions, letting me ease into the group at my own pace. One evening in late January, I was walking Scout through the neighborhood when I saw a moving truck parked in front of the house 2 doors down. The elderly couple who'd lived there had moved to assisted living back in November, and apparently someone new was moving in. I watched as a woman about my age directed movers carrying boxes and furniture, her voice clear and confident in the cold air. She noticed me watching and waved. I waved back, feeling Scout pull slightly on the leash, wanting to investigate. "Hi, I'm Rachel," she called out. "Just moving in. Is this your dog?" "He's gorgeous." "Sarah," I said, walking closer. "And this is Scout. Welcome to the neighborhood." We talked for a few minutes, the conversation easy and surface level. She'd just taken a job at Georgetown, teaching biology. She'd moved from Boston. She loved the neighborhood already, the old houses, the sense of community. When I mentioned I taught English at the high school nearby, her face lit up. "We should get coffee sometime," she said. "Compare notes about teaching in D.C." I agreed, gave her my number, and continued the walk with Scout, a new friend, or the possibility of one. It felt strange, the idea of making new connections, building new relationships in this life that still felt so unfinished without Daniel, but also good, like forward motion, like healing. That night I wrote in the journal I'd started keeping in December, another routine I'd fallen into. I wrote about meeting Rachel, about the book club, about how Scout had stolen a slice of pizza off my plate when I wasn't looking. Small things, normal things, the kind of things that make up a life. At the bottom of the page, I wrote, "Daniel, I miss you every single day, but I'm okay. We're okay. Thank you for Scout. Thank you for knowing what I'd need, even when I didn't. I hope wherever you are, you can see that I'm trying, that we're both trying." I closed the journal and turned off the light, and Scout sighed in his sleep beside me. And outside the window, the city hummed with life, with possibility, with all the futures we can't predict or prevent or prepare for. February brought Valentine's Day, which I'd been dreading. Last year, Daniel had surprised me with a reservation at the restaurant, where we had our first real date, had ordered my favorite wine, and held my hand across the table and made me feel like the only person in the world. This year, I spent the evening grading papers and eating takeout Chinese food, while Scout chewed on a new toy ID bought him. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't special. But it was survivable, which was something. The next day, Rachel from down the street texted asking if I wanted to grab that coffee we talked about. We met at the shop on M Street, ordered lattes, and spent 2 hours talking about everything except the things that hurt. She told me about her research on urban ecology, about trying to date in a new city, about her family back in Massachusetts. I told her about my students, about teaching literature to teenagers who mostly wanted to be on their phones, about Scout, and his training and his uncanny ability to know when I needed company. I didn't tell her about Daniel. Not yet. It felt nice to have a conversation where I was just Sarah. Not Sarah the widow, not Sarah who lost her husband. Just Sarah. When we left, Rachel said we should do it again, and I agreed, meaning it. March came in like a lion, with storms that knocked out power and flooded the creek in Rock Creek Park, closing the trail Scout and I had been walking regularly. We adapted, finding new routes through the neighborhood, exploring streets we'd never walked before. I started saying hello to neighbors I'd been passing silently for months, learning names, hearing stories. Mr. Peterson, 3 houses over, had lost his wife 2 years ago. He saw me walking Scout and came out to say hello, to share that he understood that it got easier but never easy. That some days you just had to keep putting one foot in front of the other. That's what the dog is for, he said, nodding at Scout. They give you a reason to keep going even when you don't want to. Daniel knew that, I said. He planned ahead. Smart man, Mr. Peterson said. You were lucky to have him. I was, I agreed. I still am, in a way. The conversation stayed with me for days. That idea that we still carry the people we've lost, that they shape us even in their absence. Daniel was still teaching me things, still pushing me to grow, still taking care of me through Scout, through the routines he'd known I'd need, through the community he'd helped build that was now catching me in my falling. April brought spring and allergies, and the end of another school year looming. My students were restless, ready for summer, barely interested in the final units on poetry and short fiction. I didn't blame them. I was restless too, ready for a break, for time to breathe and figure out what came next. On a Saturday in mid-April, I woke up and realized it had been 7 months since Daniel died. 7 months of surviving, of adapting, of slowly rebuilding a life I hadn't wanted to rebuild. 7 months of Scout's steady presence, his routine, his quiet insistence that life continued whether I was ready or not. I took him to Rock Creek Park, now reopened after the storm damage had been repaired. We walked for hours, farther than we'd ever gone, following trails that wound through woods and along the creek and up hills that left me breathless and grateful for my body as strength. At the top of one particularly steep climb, I stopped to rest on a bench overlooking the city. Scout sat beside me, panting, his tongue lolling out in what looked like a smile. We're going to make it, I told him, told the city spread out below us, told Daniel somewhere in the universe. I don't know what it's going to look like, this life without him. But we're going to make it. Scout leaned against my leg, solid and warm and alive, and I knew it was true. The school year ended with the usual chaos of finals and graduations and Teacher Appreciation Week, where students brought in donuts and wrote nice notes and reminded me why I'd chosen this profession. The quiet girl who'd given me the card in December stopped by my classroom on the last day. I'm coming back next year, she said. I wasn't going to. Things were really bad. But I'm coming back. I'm glad, I said, and meant it with everything in me. I'll see you in September. Summer stretched ahead, long and unstructured, slightly terrifying in its openness. But I had plans, small ones. Rachel and I were going to take a weekend trip to the beach. My sister was coming to visit in July. I'd signed up for a pottery class at the community center, something I'd always wanted to try. And I'd keep walking Scout, keep showing up, keep living this life one day at a time. On a Tuesday in June, exactly 9 months after Daniel died, I woke up before my alarm. Scout was already awake, sitting by the bed, watching me with patient eyes. I got up, got dressed, clipped on his leash, and we walked out into the early morning light. The neighborhood was quiet, except for birdsong and the distant sound of traffic. The air smelled like summer, like possibility, like all the days stretching ahead. We walked our usual route, past Mrs. Chun's roses, past the house where Rachel lived, past the corner store and the park, and all the places that had become familiar had become home. When we got back to the house, I fed Scout and made coffee and sat on the back steps watching the sun climb higher in the sky. I thought about Daniel, about the letter he'd written, about how he'd known exactly what I'd need, even when I hadn't known myself. I thought about the last 9 months, about how impossible they'd seemed, and how I'd survived them anyway. I thought about the future, about all the things I still didn't know, still couldn't control, still had to face. And I thought about Scout, about this dog I hadn't wanted who'd become the reason I got up in the morning, the reason I left the house, the reason I kept going when giving up seemed easier. This gift from my husband, this last act of love, this four-legged creature who asked for so little and gave so much. Thank you, I said out loud, to Daniel, to Scout, to the universe that had somehow carried me through the worst thing I'd ever faced. Thank you for the footsteps. Thank you for the dawn. Thank you for showing me that even when everything ends, something new can begin. Scout came to sit beside me, and I put my arm around him, and we sat there together, as the day began, as life continued, as the world kept turning, despite everything that had been lost, and everything that remained. The morning stretched ahead of us, full of ordinary moments and small mercies, and the quiet grace of simply being here, being alive, being enough. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't know how many more hard days waited around corners I couldn't see. But I knew I wouldn't face them alone. I had Scout, I had myself, stronger than I'd known. And I had the memory of a man who loved me enough to make sure I'd be okay, even after he was gone. Come on, buddy, I said, standing up, brushing off my jeans. Let's go see what the day brings. Scout's tail wagged, and we went back inside together, into the house that was finally feeling like home again, into a future that was uncertain, but no longer impossible, into whatever came next with the kind of quiet courage that comes from surviving what you thought would destroy you. And that, I thought as I poured more coffee and started making a grocery list, and let Scout out one more time into the backyard, that was enough. For today, for this moment, for this life I was still learning how to live, it was enough.